There is a paradox at the center of the most famous archaeological discovery in history, and it is worth sitting with before the story begins. The young pharaoh, whose face is now recognized everywhere, on posters and exhibition banners and the covers of countless books, in museums from Cairo to London to New York, was, for roughly 3,000 years, almost entirely forgotten. Not lost in the ordinary way that ancient things become lost, deliberately erased. His name was struck from the official lists of rulers. His monuments were dismantled or reassigned. The priests and administrators who came after him worked methodically to remove him from the record, and they very nearly succeeded. What they could not have known, as they smoothed his name from the stone, was that the same forgetting that was meant to end him would, in the end, preserve him. A pharaoh no one remembered was a pharaoh no one had bothered to rob, and 3,000 years later, when a stubborn British archaeologist refused to accept that the Valley of the Kings had given up everything it had to give, the forgotten boy was waiting exactly where he had been left. Before we go further, if this kind of story is what brings you here at night, subscribing to the channel means the next one will be waiting for you when you are ready. There is no better company at this hour than history. Now, let us begin. It is early morning in the Valley of the Kings, and the light has not yet reached the floor of the valley, the high limestone cliffs still holding the shadow, while the sky above them turns from grey to the pale gold that comes just before the sun clears the ridge. The air is cold and dry, the way desert air is always cold before the heat arrives, carrying with it the smell of dust and something older underneath. The dry mineral breath of ancient rock that has been sealed from the atmosphere for longer than most things in the world have existed. The valley is quiet at this hour, the way places are quiet when they have been the same for a very long time. The quiet is not emptiness. It is accumulation. 3,000 years of silence laid down in layers, the way the sand itself is laid down, one undisturbed season over another, each one pressing the last deeper into the rock. The valley is a narrow cleft cut into the limestone plateau on the west bank of the Nile, a place that would not draw a traveler's eye from the river, that announces nothing of its contents from the outside, that looks to anyone who doesn't know what they are looking at, like a dry ravine among dry ravines. What it contains, or what it once contained, is the burial ground of the most powerful rulers the ancient world had yet produced. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom, men and women who commanded an empire stretching from the Sudan to the borders of what is now Syria, who had held Egypt together for the better part of 400 years before the valley filled with sand and was forgotten. The tombs were cut directly into the cliff face, long descending corridors driven horizontally into the rock, their walls painted with the texts and images that the Egyptians believed the dead would need to navigate the afterlife. The Egyptians had been burying their rulers in elaborate subterranean chambers for 1,000 years before the New Kingdom began, and in that time they had refined their understanding of what such a burial required into something close to a complete philosophical system. Every element of the tomb, every image on every wall, every object placed in every chamber was there for a reason. The bed was not furniture. The food was not food. The gold was not wealth. Everything was practical, in the sense that the Egyptians understood practical, which was to say, everything was a tool for the work of dying and being reborn. The valley had been used as a royal burial ground for roughly 4 centuries, from the beginning of the 18th dynasty in the 16th century before the Common Era to the end of the 20th dynasty in the 11th. and in that time it had accumulated the tombs of more than 60 rulers and members of the royal family. By the time the last tomb was sealed, the cliffs above were honeycombed with chambers that no living person could fully account for. Some of them long since robbed, some of them stripped by later pharaohs who needed materials for their own projects, some of them simply lost beneath the rubble and the wind-driven sand. The valley was, by the end of the New Kingdom, already half a mystery to the people who lived beside it. The world outside the valley in the 14th century, before the Common Era, was not the world of the pyramids, that earlier Egypt that most people picture when they think of ancient Egypt at all. The pyramid builders had been dead for 1,000 years by the time the pharaohs of the New Kingdom began cutting their tombs into the limestone of the valley. The Egypt of the 14th century was an imperial power of the first order, a state with a professional army and a diplomatic service and a system of international correspondence conducted in the Akkadian language that served, at that moment in history, as the common tongue of the educated classes across the Near East. Egypt's trading partners stretched from the shores of the Aegean to the plains of Mesopotamia. Its rivals were Babylon and the Hittite Empire of Central Anatolia, powers that competed with Egypt for control of the Syrian trade routes and that corresponded with the pharaoh in terms of formal equality, addressing him as a brother king and expecting the same courtesy in return. This was the world into which Tutankhamun was born, at some point in the first half of the 14th century before the Common Era. The exact date uncertain in the way that most things about him are uncertain. He was almost certainly a son of the pharaoh Akhenaten, though even this is debated among historians who have spent careers on the Amarna period, and the name of his mother is not securely established. What we know with confidence, we know largely from his body. He was young, probably no more than 9 or 10 years old when he came to the throne, and probably around 18 or 19 when he died. And his skeleton shows the wear of a physically difficult life compressed into a short span. A club foot that would have made walking painful. The effects of malaria in his blood. The complications of short span. A club AIDS. A genetic inheritance that was the product of generations of close family marriage within the royal dynasty. But before we can understand Tutankhamun, we need to understand the disruption he was born into, because the world he inherited was not the settled, long-running Egypt of the textbooks. It was a kingdom in shock, and the shock had a name, and the name was his father, Akhenaten, who ruled Egypt for roughly 17 years in the middle of the 14th century before the Common Era, is one of the strangest figures in the history of the ancient world. And that is a category with considerable competition. He did something that no one had done before him, and no one would do again in quite the same way. He looked at the most stable, most deeply embedded religious system the ancient world had produced and decided, apparently from personal conviction rather than political calculation, to replace it. The Egyptian gods had been accumulating for 2,000 years before Akhenaten came to the throne. A vast theological system that incorporated hundreds of deities in shifting relationships of identity and hierarchy, each with their temples and their priesthoods and their festivals and their established roles in the management of the cosmos. The people who maintained this system were not a minor constituency. The priests of Amun at Karnak alone controlled wealth and land and administrative structures that rivaled the pharaoh's own. They were, in every practical sense, a state within the state. Akhenaten dismantled it. He did not do this gradually or diplomatically. He closed the temples. He suppressed the cults. He struck the name of Amun from monuments across Egypt, sending workers to chip the hieroglyphs from the walls wherever they appeared. He installed a single deity in place of the entire ancient system. a sun disk called the Aten, and he devoted his reign to the exclusive worship of this god with an intensity that left very little room for the ordinary business of running an empire. He built a new capital city in the desert, a place called Akhetaten, on a site where no previous settlement had stood, as if he wanted to begin Egypt again from an unmarked piece of ground. He moved his court there and kept it there, and appears to have been genuinely absorbed in the religious and artistic program of his new order in ways that his generals and diplomats and foreign correspondents found, at times, extremely difficult to work with. The letters that survive from the Amarna period include communications from Egypt's vassal states in Syria and Canaan, pleading for military support that never arrived, describing raids and losses and the steady erosion of Egyptian influence in the region, while the pharaoh devoted his attention to hymns. Whether Akhenaten was a visionary or a catastrophist, or simply a man whose particular obsessions happened to scale to imperial consequences, is a question historians are still working through, and it is unlikely to be settled. What is not in dispute is the state of things when he died. Somewhere around 1336, before the Common Era, the temples were closed. The priesthoods were displaced and furious, the vassal network was fraying, the diplomatic correspondence was in arrears, and the new capital he had built was already beginning to look like a monument to an experiment that had not gone as planned. Into this situation, a boy was placed on the throne. He was called Tutankhamun when he came to power, a name meaning living image of the Aten, the god his father had installed. Within the first years of his reign, under guidance from the advisors who surrounded him, the name was changed to Tutankhamun, replacing the Aten with Amun, the old god, the one whose name had been chiseled from every wall. The temples were reopened. The old cults were restored. The court was moved back to the traditional capital. The new city in the desert was left to the sand. Everything that Akhenaten had done was, with methodical deliberateness, undone, and the work of undoing it extended to the erasure of his name and the names of those associated with him, including, eventually, the name of his son. The boy ruled for roughly 9 years, long enough to oversee the restoration, but not long enough to consolidate anything of his own. He died without a male heir. His widow, a young woman named Tutankhamun, sent a letter to the Hittite king asking him to send one of his sons to marry her so that she would not have to marry a commoner, and the letter is one of the most human documents to survive from the ancient world. A queen in a position of complete vulnerability writing to a foreign ruler in a tone of barely concealed desperation. The Hittite prince who was sent never arrived. He died on the journey under circumstances that were suspicious enough to occasion a diplomatic crisis. The throne passed to an elderly official named Ai, who was followed by a general named Horemheb, and Horemheb, in securing his own legitimacy, ensured that the erasure of the Amarna period was complete. The names of Akhenaten and Tutankhamun and the short-lived rulers between them were removed from the official king lists. The record showed a clean succession from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, as if the intervening 30 years had never happened. The boy was placed in his tomb. The valley received him, as it had received all the others, without ceremony or announcement. The funeral procession descended the long path into the cleft in the rock. The priests performed the rituals, the doorway was sealed, and the sand began its slow work of covering everything that had been left behind. For 3,200 years, nothing disturbed him. The man who changed this was not, by the conventional measures of his profession, an obvious candidate for the most significant archaeological discovery in history. Howard Carter had come to Egypt for the first time in 1891 at the age of 17, hired as a tracer of facsimiles for the Egypt Exploration Fund. which is to say his first job in the field was copying the images from tomb walls onto paper so that they could be published. He had no university degree. He had no family connections in the academic world that governed access and opportunity in British archaeology at the end of the 19th century. What he had was an extraordinary eye for the physical detail of an archaeological site, a capacity for concentrated, systematic work that his colleagues found impressive and sometimes exhausting, and a stubbornness in the face of discouraging evidence that had, depending on who you asked, either kept him searching for a decade and a half when anyone sensible would have moved on, or had simply been the most important quality any archaeologist could possess. Carter had worked in Egypt long enough to know it as a place rather than a project. He had been Inspector General of Monuments in Upper Egypt, a position he lost after a confrontation with a group of French tourists in 1905. An incident involving an altercation over access to a site that Carter handled in a way that satisfied his own sense of professional dignity and satisfied very few other people. He had spent several years after that in a reduced professional position, selling watercolors to tourists before the Earl of Carnarvon entered his life. George Herbert, the fifth Earl of Carnarvon, was a wealthy English aristocrat who had come to Egypt for his health after a serious motor accident and had developed, under Carter's guidance, a serious interest in Egyptology. He became Carter's patron, funding a series of excavations in the Theban area. Their partnership was productive, but not until 1914, focused on the Valley of the Kings. The agreement Carter reached with the Egyptian authorities gave him the concession to excavate the valley, and he began the systematic work that he believed would eventually locate the tomb he was looking for. He had become convinced, from a study of the historical record and from a handful of finds that pointed in the same direction, that the tomb of Tutankhamun was somewhere in the valley and that it had not yet been found. The consensus among his colleagues was that he was wrong. The valley had been excavated by Theodore Davis, his predecessor in the concession, who had spent years searching it and had famously declared, when he gave up his concession in 1914, that the valley was exhausted. Carter thought Davis had been thorough but not systematic. Carter thought there was a specific area of the valley floor near the entrance that Davis had used as a spoil dump and had never properly cleared. He spent the years of the First World War waiting. When excavation resumed, he worked through the valley section by section with the grid-based methodical patience that was the quality his colleagues most associated with him. Season after season produced nothing of significance. By the autumn of 1922, Carnarvon had been funding the work for several years beyond what he had originally intended, and he was done. He wrote to Carter to say that he was prepared to give up the concession. Carter's response was to travel to Highclere Castle, Carnarvon's country house in Hampshire, and make his case in person for one final season. He was persuasive enough, or Carnarvon was fond enough of him, that the funding was extended. Carter returned to Egypt in October 1922 with enough money for one more attempt. He had one triangle of ground left to clear. The expedition house sat at the edge of the valley, a low, practical building that Carter had built to his own specifications, functional in the way that a working man's working space is functional, with no concessions to comfort beyond what the work required. In the autumn of 1922, he was sitting at the small desk near the window, the same desk where he had sat through 11 seasons of searching, the same window looking out over the same pale cliffs, the walls around him covered in the accumulated paper of years, survey maps and section drawings and excavation logs, and the correspondence with Carnarvon that had grown steadily more difficult to write as the seasons passed without result. He was 57 years old, which is to say he had spent roughly a third of his life in this valley and the valley had not yet told him what he needed to know. The house was modest by any standard, certainly by the standard of the aristocratic patronage that paid for the excavation. But Carter had never been a man who required comfort in the conventional sense. What he required was access to the site, proximity to the work, the ability to be in the valley at first light, and to remain there until the light failed. He had built the house where he could watch the cliffs from his window, which was either the habit of a man who understood that his work and his life had become the same thing, or the habit of a man who simply couldn't bring himself to look away. He had come to Egypt for the first time in the autumn of 1891, not as an archaeologist in the formal sense, but as a draftsman, hired by the Egypt Exploration Fund to copy the wall paintings in the tombs of Beni Hassan, a group of Middle Kingdom burial chambers carved into the limestone cliffs of Middle Egypt. He was 17 years old, the son of a Norfolk artist named Samuel Carter, who had trained his son to draw before the boy had any very clear idea of what he would be drawing. The Egypt Exploration Fund needed people who could produce accurate facsimiles of ancient images, and Carter could draw with the kind of precision that the work required, copying the fine lines of hieroglyphic inscriptions and the painted figures of the ancient dead with a fidelity that satisfied even the exacting standards of the Egyptologists who reviewed his output. It was not a prestigious entry into the field. The young men who came to Egypt to make careers in archaeology in the 1890s typically came with university degrees and the social connections that smoothed the path to official positions and institutional support. Carter had none of these. He had left school at an early age, his formal education limited to what his father could provide, and the world of Oxford-educated Egyptologists that governed access and appointment in the field was not, on the face of it, a world that had obvious room for a working-class draftsman from Norfolk. What he had, in place of the credentials he lacked, was the thing that cannot be taught and cannot be conferred and cannot be inherited, a native genius for reading a site, an ability to look at an expanse of apparently undifferentiated ground and understand what it contained, that his colleagues recognized and respected even when they found his manner difficult. He had learned his archaeology from the ground up, working under Flinders Petrie, the most demanding field archaeologist of his generation, a man who believed that the physical evidence of the past deserved a reverence and a precision that most of his contemporaries were not willing to bring to it, and who instilled in Carter not just the methods but the conviction behind them. Petrie believed that every object had a context, and that a context destroyed was information lost forever, and that the romantic image of the treasure-hunting excavator was an insult to the discipline. Carter absorbed this. He became, in time, one of the most methodical excavators of his era, a man who understood that archaeology was not the finding of things, but the recording of things in the exact conditions of their finding, and that an object removed from its context without a precise record of where it lay and what surrounded it was an object that had been damaged by its discovery. This was not, in the 1890s, a universal position in the field. Egypt was full of excavators who worked quickly and documented carelessly, whose primary interest was in the objects rather than the record, who regarded the context of a find as an inconvenient delay between the discovery and the display case. Carter could not work this way. It was not merely professional preference, it was temperament. He was, by every account, a difficult man in exactly the way that a person of absolute conviction is always difficult, unwilling to compromise on what he understood to be the correct way of doing things, intolerant of sloppiness in others, and possessed of a directness that his social superiors sometimes found insufficiently deferential. The incident with the French tourists had cost him his position as Inspector General of Monuments in Upper Egypt, and it was the kind of story that revealed something essential about the man. A group of French visitors had come to a site where Carter's Egyptian guards were working and had demanded entry without the appropriate authorization. And when the guards declined, the French tourists became aggressive, and Carter had supported his guards, which is to say he had refused to back down in the face of pressure from people who expected, on the basis of their nationality and their class, that their expectations would be accommodated. The Egyptian authorities, caught between an offended French constituency and a British official who had acted within his rights but had done so in a way that created an international irritation, chose the path of least resistance. Carter was asked to apologize. He declined. He lost the position. The years after the French tourists incident were difficult ones for Carter in a professional sense. He was no longer in an official position, no longer guaranteed access to the sites he had devoted his working life to understanding, and the informal work he could find, selling watercolors to tourists and acting as a guide and occasional consultant, was a significant reduction in both income and purpose. The experience of being useful in a very limited way, when you are capable of something considerably larger, is not one that sits easily on a person of Carter's disposition, and those years have the quality, in retrospect, of a man waiting to be given back his proper work. The person who eventually gave it back was George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, who had come to Egypt in 1907 for his health after a serious motor accident in Germany that had left him with damaged lungs and a constitution that the English winter no longer suited. Carnarvon was a wealthy and intelligent man with a genuine interest in Egyptology that went beyond the collecting impulse that drew many wealthy Europeans to Egypt in the early 20th century, and he needed a professional partner who could direct his resources into productive excavation. Carter was recommended to him, and Carnarvon hired him, and the arrangement that resulted was one of those partnerships of complementary necessity that work precisely because each party supplies what the other lacks. Carnarvon had the money and the social position that opened doors in the antiquities establishment. Carter had the expertise and the methodical patience that turned access into results. Their partnership was not always smooth. Carter's directness was not a quality that everyone found easy, and Carnarvon moved in circles where directness was considered optional at best and impolite at worst. But the work produced results, and Carnarvon was sufficiently committed to the results to tolerate the manner of the man who produced them, and in time the relationship became something genuinely warm on both sides, a friendship built on the particular intimacy of shared obsession. When Carter proposed that they seek the concession to excavate the Valley of the Kings, Carnarvon agreed, and when the Egyptian authorities granted the concession in 1914, they began what both of them understood would be the most ambitious and expensive project of their collaboration. The war interrupted it almost immediately. The excavation seasons from 1915 to 1915 were suspended, and Carter spent those years in a state of enforced patience that was, for a man of his disposition, almost physically uncomfortable. When he returned to the valley in 1917, he brought with him the systematic grid-based methodology he had devised, a plan to work through the valley section by section, clearing each defined area to bedrock before moving to the next, leaving nothing unexamined, taking nothing on faith. It was the approach of a man who had learned to trust methodology over inspiration, because inspiration, however compelling it felt, had a way of leading excavators to spend their resources where the evidence pointed, rather than where the gap in the evidence suggested. The seasons passed, each one following the same pattern. Arrival in October, assembly of the crew, clearance of the designated section, records and drawings and notes through the winter months, departure in the spring, return to England, and a summer spent reviewing what the season had produced, which was never very much. Between 1917 and 1920, Carter worked through the valley in this methodical way, season after season, clearing the bedrock and finding nothing of significance in the areas he cleared. The survey maps accumulated in his expedition house, one completed section after another, and the uncompleted area grew smaller with each season that passed. His colleagues, who had been skeptical from the beginning, were confirmed in their skepticism. The valley was exhausted, they said. They had been right. Carter was a capable archaeologist who had been pursuing a dead hypothesis for too long, and it was time, the consensus suggested, to acknowledge that the evidence had not supported the theory and to redirect his considerable skills towards something more productive. Carter did not find this consensus persuasive. Pause here for a moment and hold the shape of the man this story is about, because it matters. Howard Carter was not the swashbuckling archaeologist of popular imagination, not the adventurer who ran toward the unknown because the unknown excited him. He was something more interesting and, in retrospect, more fitting. A professional of absolute rigor who pursued a specific hypothesis through 11 years of systematic, often tedious, consistently unproductive work, not because he was certain he was right, but because he could not find a sufficiently compelling reason to believe he was wrong. The Valley of the Kings had not told him Tutankhamun's tomb was there. It had simply not told him it wasn't. The hypothesis had a specific basis, and Carter had assembled it carefully over many years of study. The first element was the historical record, which showed a clear gap. Tutankhamun appeared in the ancient king lists in his corrected, post-Amarna form only in fragments, and the lists that survived from later periods contained no entry for him at all, because the erasure of the Amarna pharaohs had been more or less complete. But the erasure was not absolute, and in the gaps and inconsistencies of the record, something remained. There were traces. There were objects with his name that had turned up in various contexts across the Theban area. There were references to his burial in documents that the erasure had not reached. Carter read all of this and concluded that the tomb existed and that it was in the valley, and he held that conclusion through more than a decade, during which the valley gave him almost no encouragement to keep holding it. The second element was Theodore Davis, Carter's predecessor in the Valley Concession, who had excavated extensively between 1902 and 1914 and had found a great deal, including the tombs of several important New Kingdom figures, but who had not found Tutankhamun. Davis had concluded, when he gave up his concession in 1914, that the valley was finished, that he had effectively cleared it, that whatever remained was debris and rubble of no significance. Carter disagreed, and his disagreement was precise. Davis had worked methodically, but not in every area. There was a section of the valley floor near the entrance, a roughly triangular patch of ground that Davis had used as a spoil dump, depositing the detritus from his own excavations over it, effectively burying it under the waste product of his own search. Davis had never cleared this area. Carter believed, on the basis of a small number of objects associated with Tutankhamun that Davis had found in the vicinity, that the area deserved very close attention. There had been other hints. In 1907, Davis's team had found a small pit nearby containing materials that appeared to be connected with a royal burial, embalming equipment and linen and pottery, and a small faience cup bearing the name Tutankhamun. Davis had decided the pit was too small and too modest to be the burial itself, and had concluded, without further investigation, that the Tutankhamun tomb had probably already been entered and robbed in antiquity, leaving only this scattered debris behind. Carter looked at the same evidence and reached the opposite conclusion. The pit was not the tomb, but a deposit of materials associated with the funeral, which meant the tomb was nearby. He had sought the valley concession after Davis gave it up in 1914, and Carnarvon had agreed to fund the excavation. And for several years they had been working their way through the valley on the systematic grid that Carter had devised, one defined area at a time, eliminating possibilities rather than pursuing inspirations. The seasons had produced almost nothing of significance, which was in one sense discouraging and in another sense informative, because every area cleared without result was an area where the tomb was not, and the area where it might be was correspondingly reduced. By the autumn of 1922, the process had done most of its work. What remained was the triangle near the entrance, and the triangle was all that was left. By the autumn of 1922, the process of elimination had done most of its work. Carter's map of the valley was covered in the marks of completed sections, areas where the bedrock had been reached and nothing of significance found. The uncompleted area, the one that remained, was the triangle near the entrance that Davis had buried under his own spoil. It was, in every practical sense, the last place in the valley that Carter hadn't tried. It was also, in terms of visual inspection, the least promising. It sat in the most visible and most trafficked part of the valley, in an area that every previous excavator had walked past and over for decades without stopping, and there was no obvious surface evidence for anything of interest beneath it. Carter began clearing it in the first days of November 1922. His crew removed the accumulated spoil, the decades of other excavators' debris, the loose stone and sand and rubble that Davis had deposited over the area in the course of his own work. It was the kind of excavation that produces nothing in the way of aesthetic reward. No painted walls coming slowly into view, no objects emerging from the soil, just the slow mechanical clearance of one man's waste material in search of the ground beneath. Carter supervised it with the same attention he brought to every stage of every excavation, the same patience, the same refusal to allow the absence of dramatic discovery to suggest that dramatic discovery was not coming. He had one unexplored triangle of ground left in his allocated area, a patch of rubble and debris near the entrance of the valley that every previous excavator had used as a dumping ground and never thought worth clearing. It was the least promising ground in the valley. It was the only ground he hadn't tried, and that is where Carter stood in the autumn of 1922, with the last permitted season beginning and the least promising ground in the valley still unexamined beneath decades of other excavators' spoil, a man who had used up almost everything, the years and the money and most of the goodwill, and who had not yet used up the one thing that had brought him this far. We can move forward now to the 4th of November, and to a morning that began like every other morning of the excavation and did not end like any morning that had come before it. Something was about to surface from 3,000 years of darkness, and no one standing in the valley that day knew it yet. The water boy was young, one of the smaller members of Carter's Egyptian crew, and his job on that particular morning was neither complicated nor interesting. He was assigned to clear sand from the area near the entrance to the valley that Carter had designated for attention that season, using a stick to break up the surface and sweep the loose material to the side so that the men behind him could work more efficiently. It was the kind of task that gets given to the youngest and least experienced members of an excavation crew, manual and repetitive, requiring patience more than skill, and the boy was doing it in the way that you do a task whose end you cannot see. working steadily through the loose sand and debris without any particular expectation of what the next few inches of ground might contain. Then his stick hit something that was not sand. It was not the soft resistance of compacted debris or the irregular obstruction of a loose stone. It was the hard, flat resistance of something cut and intentional, and the boy stopped and looked down and called out to the men near him. Carter was at his expedition house when the message came. What the crew had found, once they had cleared the sand from around it, was the top step of a staircase cut into the bedrock of the valley floor. A single stone-cut step descending into the earth at an angle that was consistent with the approach to a tomb entrance. Carter looked at it. He had been in the valley long enough, had examined enough tomb entrances in enough conditions of preservation and decay to understand immediately what a stone-cut step descending into the bedrock of the Valley of the Kings meant. He ordered the crew to stop work. What he did next tells you something important about who he was. A different archaeologist, or a different kind of person entirely, might have continued clearing. The step was there. The direction of the staircase was apparent, and the logical next action was to follow it down and see where it led. Carter had been waiting 11 years for exactly this moment. He stopped. He sent the crew to cover the exposed step with the spoil they had already removed, concealing what had been found and protecting the site from disturbance. And then he sent a telegram to Carnarvon, who was at Highclere Castle in England. And in the telegram he used language that was, by his standards, as close to excitement as he usually allowed himself to get. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley. He did not specify what the discovery was. He simply said it was wonderful, and he said it was in the valley, and that was enough. The reason for the covering and the waiting was methodological, but it was also personal. Carter understood that what was beneath that step, if it was what he thought it was, belonged to Carnarvon as much as it belonged to him, and that Carnarvon had earned the right to be present when the discovery was confirmed. But there was something else in it, too. Something that is harder to name, but that anyone who has waited a very long time for something and then found it will recognize. The sense that the moment of confirmation, once it has passed, cannot be revisited, and that the right response to the imminent arrival of what you have been waiting for is to slow down and ensure that it is received with the full attention it deserves. Carnarvon received the telegram at Highclere and replied within hours. He would come. He would arrive as quickly as arrangements could be made. Carter recovered the step and waited, and the wait lasted 17 days. Those 17 days are worth imagining, because they are in some ways the most human part of the story. Carter had placed the guard on the site to ensure that no one approached the covered staircase in his absence, and he returned to his expedition house and occupied himself with the correspondence and administrative work that an active excavation generates in considerable quantity. He would have had reason to walk past the site every day. He would have seen the mound of redeposited spoil, unremarkable from any distance, hiding the top of the staircase beneath it. He would have known, every time he passed, what was underneath, and that it would not be touched until Carnarvon arrived. Whether he found this self-imposed restraint peaceful or agonizing is not something the historical record specifies, but it is difficult to imagine a man of his disposition, in those circumstances, experiencing 17 days of untroubled equanimity. Let that sit for a moment, because it is one of the stranger acts of discipline in the history of archaeological discovery. Carter had found the top of a staircase that he believed, with the conviction of a man who had been building his case for more than a decade, led to the intact burial chamber of a forgotten Egyptian king. He covered it. He went back to his expedition house. He waited 17 days for his patron to travel from England to Egypt before he allowed a single additional stone to be moved. The discipline this required is not simply professional patience. It is the behavior of a man who understood that the discovery he had made was not his alone, and that acting alone would be a kind of theft even from himself. Carnarvon had spent years and a considerable sum of money on a project that his own social circle considered eccentric, and the least Carter could give him was the experience of being present at the moment it all resolved. Carnarvon arrived at Luxor on the 23rd of November, accompanied by his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, and Carter met them at the station. They traveled together to the valley, and on the morning of the 24th, Carter gave the order to resume clearing. The crew removed the concealing spoil, and the top of the staircase was revealed again, and then the crew began clearing downward, step by step, each one cut from the same pale limestone as the cliffs above, descending at a steady angle into the floor of the valley. There were 16 steps in all. The staircase was narrow enough that two people could not descend it side by side, and it ended at a doorway sealed with plastered stones, the plaster bearing the marks of the necropolis seal, the jackal and the 9 bound captives that the priests of the royal burial ground had used for centuries to mark the sealed tombs under their protection. Carter examined the door carefully. It was sealed, which was significant. Most of the tombs in the valley had been entered by robbers at some point, and entry left traces, repairs, evidence of resealing. This door appeared to be intact, but the seal impressions Carter could read on the lower portion of the door were the generic necropolis seal, not a royal cartouche, and Carter needed to know whose tomb this was before he could know what he had found. He had the lower portion of the door cleared further, and in the plaster at the bottom of the door, partially obscured but legible, he found what he was looking for. The name was there, the cartouche of Tutankhamun, pressed into the ancient clay. He had been right. The boy was here. Everything Carter had argued for, everything he had worked toward through 11 seasons of systematic, inconclusive, patient work had resolved into this. A sealed door in the bedrock of the Valley of the Kings bearing the name of the pharaoh he had come to find. Pause here with him on that staircase in that narrow cleft of cut stone, looking at a plastered door that had been sealed for more than 3,000 years. The light would have been coming from above, from the mouth of the staircase, the pale winter light of the Egyptian morning falling at an angle into the cutting and illuminating the door and the plaster impressions in the way that angled light illuminates things it was not designed to illuminate. Carter was 57 years old. He had been in Egypt in one capacity or another since he was 17. He had spent more of his adult life thinking about what was behind a door like this one than about almost anything else. And now the door was in front of him. But there was a complication, and Carter, who noticed everything, had noticed it. There were traces of resealing on the upper portion of the door. The necropolis priests had repaired a break in the plaster at some point after the original sealing, which meant the tomb had been entered at least once after burial. This was not uncommon in the valley. Robbers had reached most of the known tombs, usually within decades of the burial, sometimes within years. The question was not whether the tomb had been entered, but how thoroughly it had been cleared. Carter stood at the door and held both possibilities in his mind, with the evenness of a man who had trained himself not to reach conclusions before the evidence was in. The door before him might lead to a chamber stripped to bare walls, as empty as every other tomb the valley had produced, or it might lead to something else entirely. He did not open it that day. The inner passage beyond the sealed door would need to be cleared, and the work of clearing would take another day or more. And he had already waited 17 days and could wait another one. He sent a telegram that evening to a small number of trusted colleagues, reporting the find and indicating that the inner door would be opened the following day. The telegram was private. The valley was, for the moment, quiet. The press had not yet arrived, and the world outside the narrow cleft of the staircase did not yet know what had been found. The 26th of November 1922 is the date that appears in Carter's records as the day the inner doorway was opened. The passage beyond the outer door had been filled with rubble, a deliberate precaution by the original burial party, and clearing it had taken the previous day's work. The rubble, as it was removed, produced further evidence of ancient entry and resealing. The fill had been disturbed and repacked in one area, suggesting that whoever had entered the tomb in antiquity had done so by tunneling through the rubble fill and then replacing it behind them. Carter noted this without drawing conclusions. He was not yet at the inner door. The passage itself was narrow and descended at an angle that made the clearing work physically demanding. The crew working in a confined space by lamplight, passing baskets of rubble up to the mouth of the staircase and from there out into the valley. In the rubble of the passage fill, as it came out, there were objects, sherds of pottery, fragments of boxes, small items that had been placed in or near the passage and then swept aside by the ancient intruders as they tunneled through. Carter examined each one carefully before passing it up the chain. The objects were consistent with the reign of Tutankhamun. The tomb was not empty. He kept this conclusion to himself and continued supervising the clearance. The inner doorway, when they reached it, was sealed in the same manner as the outer one, plastered and stamped with the necropolis seal. Carter cleared the plaster from a small area at the upper left corner of the door, creating an opening just large enough to admit a candle and a line of sight. The process of clearing had taken hours, and it was evening by the time he stood before the gap, and the people present were Carnarvon and his daughter and Carter's assistant Arthur Callender, and the small number of Egyptian workers who had been part of the clearing crew. Carter held a candle to the gap and waited. He was waiting for the air inside the sealed chamber to equalize with the air in the passage, a precaution against the candle flame being extinguished by the rush of air from the opening. The equalization took a moment. Then he leaned forward and brought his eye to the gap. Carnarvon was standing close behind him. In Carter's own account, Carnarvon asked him, after a long silence, whether he could see anything. Carter's reply has become the most quoted sentence in the history of archaeology. Yes, wonderful things. The silence before the reply lasted long enough for Carnarvon, by his own later account, to feel a distinct anxiety. He could not see past Carter's head and shoulders. He could not see the candle or what it illuminated, and the man in front of him, who was not in the habit of being at a loss for words in professional situations, was not speaking. Then Carter said what he said, and the silence after it was of a different quality entirely. What Carter actually saw in those first seconds, as his eyes adjusted to the flickering candlelight and the 3,000-year-old darkness of the chamber beyond the door, was a room packed from floor to ceiling with objects, golden shapes emerging from the darkness as the candle flame caught them, a gilded couch, a golden figure, the curved neck of a golden animal head, the dismantled parts of a bar, chariot, alabaster jars in rows, the accumulated furnishings of a royal life that had been placed here in the expectation that they would never be seen by human eyes again. The chamber was not empty, it was full. The robbers who had entered in antiquity had taken some things, and the necropolis priests who had followed them had restored some order and resealed the door. But what remained was still, by any standard the ancient world could offer, Extraordinary. Carter pressed the candle further into the gap and let his eyes move around the chamber. The two guardian statues were immediately visible, facing each other across a sealed inner door on the far wall, their black and gold surfaces catching the light. The chairs and beds and boxes were stacked in the disorder of a burial party, working quickly, finding places for objects in a space that was not quite large enough to arrange them with any elegance. The intimate and the sacred and the functional, placed side by side in the practical improvisation of people who needed to finish and seal and leave. Between the legs of one of the gilded couches, he could see small wooden boxes, their surfaces painted with images he could not yet make out. Above one of the couches on the wall, there appeared to be the outlines of two small sealed shrines. The objects in the chamber had been sitting in that exact arrangement for more than 3,000 years. The burial party had placed them, the priests had made their repairs, the door had been sealed, and then the valley had filled with sand, and the world had forgotten that any of this existed. And the objects had remained exactly as they were, undisturbed in the dark. Carter understood this as he looked, and the understanding was not an abstract historical thought, but a physical sensation. The recognition that what was in front of him had been waiting in the dark for longer than most things in the world have any experience of waiting. He had been right. He pressed his candle into the gap in the sealed doorway and waited for the air to equalize. And then he leaned forward and looked, and what he saw in the flickering light after 3,000 years of darkness was the answer to a question he had been carrying for 11 years. And that was what the candle showed, and what no candle had shown in 3,000 years. The antechamber was real. The guardian statues were real. The gold was real. And everything Carter had argued and waited and been doubted for had resolved into a single room, packed with the evidence of a life that had not been as forgotten as its erasers intended. We can move further into the tomb now, past the threshold of the sealed doorway, into the space the burial party left and the sand kept, and begin to understand what the discovery actually contained. The two guardian statues faced each other across the sealed inner doorway at the far end of the antechamber, standing in the same positions they had occupied since the burial party left and sealed the door behind them more than 3,000 years before. They were life-sized figures of the king, each one carved in wood and covered in black resin, with gilded details that caught the light of Carter's lantern as he finally stepped across the threshold of the antechamber on the 2nd of January 1923, weeks after the initial opening, with the formal entrance finally documented and the official party assembled. The statues wore the Nemesis headdress and held gilded staffs and wore gilded kilts and gilded sandals, and their eyes were inlaid with obsidian and glass paste to produce an expression that Carter described as an alert and living gaze, a quality of presence that struck everyone who entered the room in those early days as unexpectedly immediate, as though the figures were attending to something rather than merely standing. The antechamber was approximately 8 meters long and 4 meters wide, which is to say it was not large, and in that space the burial party had placed an extraordinary quantity of objects, arranging them with what appeared to be a system that had been overtaken by the practical necessity of fitting everything in. 3 large gilded funerary couches stood against the right wall of the chamber, each one decorated with the heads and hindquarters of animals that had roles in the Egyptian understanding of the afterlife. A composite creature with the body of a lion and the head of a hippopotamus, a cow goddess whose horns framed a solar disk, and a creature that combined features of a cheetah and a crocodile. Chi culture, practical object made sacred by the care of its making and the seriousness of its purpose. Beneath and between the couches were boxes, dozens of them, painted and gilded and sealed. containing objects that Carter's team would spend years cataloguing: clothing and sandals and jewelry, model boats and gaming boards, linen and alabaster vessels, and the intimate, accumulated possessions of a royal life. In the northern corner of the chamber, stacked in apparent disorder, were the dismantled components of 4 gilded chariots, their wheels removed for the transit through the narrow passage. The gilded wood of the body sections lying against the wall at angles that suggested they had been placed there in the final moments of the burial, when the burial party was running out of room and running out of time. What is remarkable about the antechamber, and what Carter understood from the beginning, is that it was not the burial chamber itself. The sealed doorway between the 2 guardian statues led to at least one further room, and beyond that, somewhere in the rock, was the body of the king. The antechamber was essentially a reception room, a storage space for the objects that the Egyptians believed the dead king would need in the afterlife, and the organization of those objects reflected a theology of considerable practical detail. The Egyptians did not bury their pharaohs with symbolic tokens of royal life. They buried them with the actual equipment of royal life, because the afterlife, in their understanding, was not a vague spiritual state, but a continuation of existence requiring the same material support that existence in the present world required. Carter spent the weeks after the formal opening beginning the process of recording and removing the contents of the antechamber, a process governed by the same methodological rigor that had characterized his excavation work throughout his career. Nothing was touched without being photographed in situ. Nothing was removed without a record of its exact position and its relationship to the objects around it. The team worked in conditions of considerable physical discomfort, the temperature inside the tomb chambers rising as the number of people in them increased, the air becoming thick with the dust of 3,000 years, and Carter overseeing every stage of every operation with the attention of a man who understood that the conditions of preservation inside the tomb were the result of 32 centuries of unbroken continuity, and that any carelessness now would be a permanent loss. Let the work slow down here for a moment and sit with what the antechamber felt like in those early weeks of 1923, before the excavation had moved very far and the objects were still largely in the positions the burial party had left them. The lanterns and lamps that Carter's team used for their work produced a light that was warm and directional, the kind of light that picked out surfaces and gilded edges and painted details in a way that the flat overhead light of the modern museum does not quite replicate. The room smelled of the resins and oils that had been used in the burial process 3,000 years before, a smell that members of Carter's team described in their journals as sweet and ancient, present but not overwhelming, as though the air itself had been preserved along with everything else. And the objects in the room were not just objects. They were things that had been owned and used and valued by a specific person, a boy who had been alive in the 14th century before the Common Era, and who had probably sat in the chairs that were now stacked against the wall, and worn some of the jewelry that was in the boxes, and ridden in the chariots that were dismantled in the corner. Connected to the antechamber by another sealed doorway was a smaller room that Carter called the annexe, a low chamber crammed with objects of a more domestic character, furniture and food vessels and boxes of linen. The overflow of the burial stores, packed with the same urgency that characterized the antechamber, but with rather less organization, as though someone had opened the door and simply pushed things in. And opening off the burial chamber itself was the treasury, a room of modest dimensions but extraordinary contents, dominated at its entrance by a gilded shrine in the form of a pylon gateway the figure of the jackal god Anubis crouching on top of it with the watchful stillness of a guard who has been keeping watch for 32 centuries and has not yet found cause to relax. Beyond the Anubis shrine, the treasury contained the canopic chest that held the king's preserved organs, sealed with a gilded goddess at each corner, their arms outstretched in the gesture of divine protection. And behind the canopic chest, arranged against the walls and on the floor, were more boxes, more vessels, more gilded figures of gods and kings, more of the material abundance of a royal Ife translated into the language of the afterlife. The excavation of the tomb proceeded through the 1920s and into the early 1930s, season by season, chamber by chamber, object by object. Carter and his team documented and removed more than 5,000 objects in total, each one recorded and photographed and packed for transport to the Cairo Museum, where they remain, most of them to this day. The scale of the documentation work alone was staggering. Each object required a number, a photograph, a written description, a sketch showing its position in relation to surrounding objects, a conservation assessment, and a packing note. For objects in fragile condition, which was a significant proportion of everything in the tomb, the documentation was preceded by careful consolidation, the application of preservatives to hold damaged surfaces together long enough for the object to survive removal. The inner doorway between the guardian statues was breached on the 17th of February 1923. The sealed plaster broken and removed. The opening made large enough to admit a person, and Carter descended into the burial chamber itself. What he found there was a room almost entirely filled by 4 nested gilded shrines, rectangular structures of gilded wood that fitted inside each other like boxes, the largest one nearly touching all 4 walls of the chamber, the space between the outermost shrine and the chamber walls barely wide enough to move through. The shrines were bolted shut on every panel with bronze fixtures, each bolt secured by a cord and sealed with the royal seal, and every seal was intact. What was inside the outermost shrine had not been touched since the burial party sealed it. Working through the nested shrines took Carter and his team several seasons. The outermost shrine alone was large enough that dismantling it required the creation of a pulley system to lift the gilded panels without damaging them. The work proceeding with the extreme care that Carter applied to every stage of the excavation and that his colleagues sometimes found almost painfully slow. Each panel was numbered and recorded in its position before removal, the gilding examined for damage, the wooden substrate assessed for structural integrity. The outermost shrine was dismantled panel by panel, revealing the second shrine inside it, which was in turn dismantled, and then the third, and then the fourth. Inside the 4th shrine was a sarcophagus of yellow quartzite, its lid a single massive slab of granite painted to match the quartzite body, and on the lid of the sarcophagus lay a garland of flowers that the burial party had placed there and that had lain undisturbed for 32 centuries. The individual blossoms were dried to a dull ochre, their color long since gone, but they retained their shape and their arrangement with a fidelity that made it possible to identify the species. Cornflowers and olive leaves and blue water lily petals, the kinds of flowers that would have been in bloom in Egypt during the late autumn months when, we believe, the king was buried. Someone had gathered these flowers and arranged them on the lid of the sarcophagus. And then the burial party had sealed the shrine around them, and they had remained exactly where they were placed for 32 centuries. They were the last things placed there. They were the last things Carter reached. Inside the sarcophagus were 3 nested coffins. The outermost coffin was made of gilded wood and depicted the king in the form of Osiris, his arms crossed over his chest, holding the crook and flail, the gilded surface inlaid with colored glass paste and semi-precious stones to create bands of ornament that ran the full length of the figure. The second coffin, inside the first, was also gilded wood, also in the form of Osiris, also inlaid, but with a heavier quality of ornament, more gold per surface area, more complexity in the inlay. The third coffin was solid gold. It weighed 110 kilograms. It was 2 meters long. It was, and remains, the largest single object of solid gold surviving from the ancient world. And it lay inside the 2 gilded wooden coffins, with its surface fully covered in an incised design of feathers, the so-called rishi pattern, that was associated in Egyptian belief with the wings of protective deities enfolding the body of the king. Inside the gold coffin, surrounded by a thick coating of black resinous material that had been poured over the body at the time of burial and that had, over 32 centuries, hardened to a substance as dense as stone, was the mummy of Tutankhamun. The mummy was in a state of significant damage, caused not by tomb robbers or time, but by the resin itself, which had been applied in excess and had bonded the linen wrappings to the interior of the golden coffin and to each other and to the body beneath so thoroughly that it was not possible in 1925, when Carter finally reached the mummy, to separate the body from the coffin without considerable physical intervention. The body of the king was fragile in the way that mummies become fragile over 3,000 years. The bones present but brittle, the tissue preserved but delicate, and the damage done by the resin and the subsequent removal meant that the mummy arrived at the examination table in a condition of considerable fragmentation. Carter documented all of this with the same completeness he brought to everything else, recording what had survived and what had not, with the level-headed precision of a man who had long since learned to accept the evidence as it was rather than as he would have preferred it to be. The excavation of the tomb in its entirety took 10 years. Carter worked through the chambers season by season until 1932, and when the last object had been recorded and removed and the tomb was finally empty, the work of documentation and publication continued for decades beyond that. The record Carter and his team left behind is one of the most complete records of any ancient burial in history, a monument to the methodological conviction that had driven his working life and that had, in the end, produced a discovery proportionate to the patience it had required. The face was covered by the mask. The mask had been placed over the head and upper chest of the mummified king at the time of burial, fitted carefully over the linen wrappings, its surfaces representing the king in idealized form, the golden face serene, the striped Nemes headdress inlaid with blue glass in the pattern of the cloth headdress worn by living pharaohs, the broad collar at the chest inlaid with turquoise and lapis lazuli, Urian carnelian, the eyes outlined in black and white to produce a gaze that was at once formal and, in the particular quality of its stillness, unexpectedly human. The mask was 54 centimeters tall and weighed more than 10 kilograms, an object of such concentrated craft and material richness that it requires some effort of imagination to remember that it was not made to be looked at. It was made to be worn in the dark by a king who would never open his eyes again. The people who made it believed this mattered, and the quality of the work reflects the completeness of that belief. The removal of the coffin lids, when Carter finally reached them, revealed a sequence of wrappings so densely layered with amulets and jewelry and sheets of gold foil that the unwrapping alone took weeks, each layer recorded before the next was touched. The objects placed within the wrappings were of extraordinary quality and intimacy. A pair of gold sandals on the feet, a dagger with a blade of iron, which was rarer than gold in Bronze Age Egypt, and more precious golden finger stalls on each finger, and around the neck and shoulders and chest, layer upon layer of jewelry that had apparently been worn by the king in life and was placed on his body to accompany him in death. The objects were personal in a way that the large pieces of tomb furniture were not. They were the things a person kept close. At the center of the innermost coffin, which was made of solid gold and weighed 110 kilograms, lay the mummy of the king himself, his face covered by the mask, his body fragile and damaged by the resins poured over it at burial, a boy who had been powerful and then forgotten and then found, wearing the face he had worn in death for 32 centuries. And that is where the archaeology ended and where something else began. The tomb had been found. The king had been reached. The 10 years of patient work had produced a record of incomparable completeness. And then the world, which had been watching all of this with a hunger that Carter had not anticipated and could not fully manage, began to do what the world does with discoveries of this kind. It looked for a story it could hold more easily than the actual one. We can step back now from the sealed chambers and the careful documentation and look at what was happening at the mouth of the staircase, in the valley and in the newspapers and in the imagination of the wider world, because what happened there is also part of this history. The cables began arriving within days of the discovery being made known. They came from newspapers in London and Paris and New York and Sydney and Buenos Aires, from wire services and magazine editors and film companies and lecture agents, from people who wanted exclusive rights to the story, and from people who simply wanted to be close to it, and the volume of them was something that neither Carter nor Carnarvon had experienced or prepared for. The Valley of the Kings, which had been a quiet and somewhat remote archaeological site, accessible mainly to specialists and the determined tourist, became within weeks of the discovery announcement the most watched piece of ground in the world, the subject of daily dispatches and the destination of journalists and photographers who camped outside the site and waited for something to report and were, and something failed to appear, reported what they imagined instead. You would not, if you had visited the valley in late November or December of 1922, have recognized it as the place Carter had described in his excavation reports. The still air, the pale cliffs, the silence that accumulated in layers. The valley in those weeks was crowded in a way it had never been crowded in the centuries of its use as a royal burial ground. There were tents pitched near the entrance and motor vehicles parked along the approach track, and delegations of officials arriving from Cairo and from the Egyptian government and from the British diplomatic service and from the world of academic Egyptology, each with their own claims on access and their own opinions about how the discovery should be managed. Carter stood at the entrance to the staircase and tried to manage them all, with the patience of a man who has learned through long experience that the management of people is a skill of a different order from the management of archaeological sites, and that he possesses the second skill rather more naturally than the first. Carnarvon had made an arrangement with the Times of London before the formal opening of the antechamber, an exclusive agreement under which the newspaper received first access to the official account of developments in the excavation in exchange for a payment that helped offset the considerable costs of the work. The arrangement was commercially sensible and professionally defensible, but it had consequences that Carnarvon did not fully foresee. Every other newspaper in the world that was not the Times of London was now locked out of the official account, and the locked-out newspapers responded by doing what newspapers do when they are locked out of official accounts. They found other sources, some reliable and some not, and they published what those sources told them, and the result was a proliferation of stories about the tomb that rang, edged from the accurate to the fanciful, the whole jumbled mass of them circulating simultaneously in publications around the world, and producing a public understanding of the discovery that bore only a partial relationship to what was actually happening inside the tomb. The Egyptian press and the Egyptian government had their own perspective on the arrangement, which was that a British aristocrat had entered into a commercial agreement with a British newspaper over the coverage of a discovery made in Egyptian territory without meaningful consultation with the Egyptian authorities, and this perspective had considerable force. Egypt in 1922 was in the process of asserting its independence from British control, having been granted nominal sovereignty the previous year, and the question of who owned the Tutankhamun discovery in a cultural and political as well as a legal sense was a question that the exclusive arrangement with the Times had done nothing to resolve and rather a lot to inflame. Carter would spend significant energy in the years after Carnarvon's death navigating the consequences of this tension, and the relationships between the excavation team and the Egyptian authorities would remain difficult for much of the remaining decade of work. Carter found this situation almost unbearable. He was a methodical man in a situation that rewarded drama over method, a careful recorder of evidence in a media environment that rewarded sensation over accuracy, and the gap between what the excavation was actually doing and what the newspapers were saying it was doing widened with each week of work. He gave interviews grudgingly and was not, by any account, comfortable in the role of public figure. His answers to reporters' questions were precise in the manner of an expert who resents being asked to simplify his expertise, and his manner in the pressed photographs of the period is that of a man who would prefer to be somewhere else, which was, invariably, inside the tomb. While the press gathered at the entrance, the work continued below. In the antechamber, Carter's small team, which included the chemist Alfred Lucas and the photographer Harry Burton and the Egyptologist Arthur Callender, and a rotating cast of specialist consultants, was working through the objects with the methodical care that Carter required. Burton's photographs documented each object in place before removal, the images producing a visual record of the antechamber as it had been found that would allow future scholars to reconstruct the arrangement in its original form. Lucas was developing preservation treatments for the objects, many of which were in fragile condition after more than 3,000 years in the tomb, the gilding lifting from the wood, the linen deteriorating when exposed to the change in temperature and humidity that the opening of the tomb had introduced. The work was slow, precise, and almost entirely invisible to the journalists waiting outside. Carnarvon died in Cairo on the 5th of April 1923, less than 5 months after the discovery of the tomb and less than 12 months after the official opening of the burial chamber. He had been in fragile health for years, the legacy of the motor accident that had first brought him to Egypt, and the cause of his death was blood poisoning following an infected mosquito bite on his cheek, complicated by pneumonia in his already damaged lungs. He was 57 years old. He had lived long enough to stand beside Carter at the opening of the antechamber and to see the guardian statues in the candlelight, and to understand that the investment of years and money and faith had produced exactly what Carter had promised it would produce. He died. Before the burial chamber was fully excavated, the reports of his death appeared in newspapers alongside the reports of the day's developments in the excavation, and the proximity of the two kinds of news in the same columns was noted and interpreted. Within days of the reports of Carnarvon's death, a writer named Marie Corelli had published a claim in an American newspaper that she possessed a rare Arabic book containing a warning about the fate of those who entered the tombs of the pharaohs, and the claim was reported and repeated and embellished across dozens of publications until it had acquired the status of established fact. Other deaths in the vicinity of the excavation were noted and added to the account. A radiologist who had x-rayed the mummy, a visitor who had touched the tomb walls, a financier who had attended the opening. The list grew as the years passed, each addition reducing the threshold of connection required, until virtually anyone who had been in the same country as the excavation at any point in the relevant years could be considered a potential victim of the curse. Let this moment settle, because it is the point at which the mythology of the tomb took its definitive shape. Carnarvon's death was reported by newspapers around the world, and within days of those reports, a story began circulating that connected his death to the tomb and to the king within it. The story invoked a curse. It claimed that the tomb bore an inscription warning that death would come to those who disturbed the king's rest, and it connected Carnarvon's death to this warning as evidence of the curse's operation. The story was compelling, as such stories always are, and it spread with the speed that compelling stories spread when there is a global press ready to carry them. What the story left out, or did not know, or chose not to investigate too closely, was that the inscription it cited did not exist in the form described. There was no curse inscription at the entrance to the tomb, or in the antechamber, or in the burial chamber. There were inscriptions in the tomb, as there were inscriptions in every New Kingdom burial, protective formulae and religious texts and references to the divine punishment that awaited those who violated the sanctity of the burial. But these were standard elements of the genre, present in every royal tomb in the valley, and they had not prevented the ancient robbers from entering or the modern excavators from following them. Carter, who had read every inscription in the tomb more carefully than any journalist, was dismissive of the curse story to the point of contempt. He said so, repeatedly in terms that were not always diplomatic. No one was particularly interested in what he said. The statistics, when researchers have examined them properly, do not support the curse. Of the people who were present at the opening of the tomb, or who were closely involved in the excavation, the majority lived to ordinary old ages. Carter himself died in 1939, 17 years after the discovery of lymphoma, at the age of 64. Arthur Callender, his closest assistant in the field, outlived him. Arthur Mace, who had helped with the initial documentation, died in 1928 of pleurisy, but had been in poor health for years before his work on the excavation began. The list of deaths that were attributed to the curse over the years included people who had visited the tomb briefly, people who had handled objects from the tomb in museum contexts, people who had simply been in Egypt at the relevant time, and people whose connection to the discovery on examination was extremely remote. When the list was assembled and the dates of death compared to actuarial expectation for people of the relevant ages and health conditions in the relevant period, the pattern disappeared. There was no pattern. There was only the human tendency to find patterns in data that does not contain them, amplified by a press environment that had every incentive to maintain the story. Carter found all of this maddening in a specific way. The curse story was not simply inaccurate. It was a distraction from the actual significance of the discovery, which was, in his understanding, historical and archaeological rather than supernatural or sensational. He had spent 11 years looking for this tomb because of what it could tell historians about the Amarna period, and about ancient Egyptian burial practice, and about a king who had been erased from the official record and whose absence from that record had, against all the intentions of those who erased him, preserved him. The curse story reduced all of this to the level of a Gothic novel, and Carter's impatience with it was the impatience of a man who cares deeply about what something means and finds himself surrounded by people who care only about what it feels like. The curse narrative served a purpose that the archaeological facts, however extraordinary, could not serve as efficiently. It provided a causal link between the ancient world and the present one, a way of understanding the discovery not as a piece of historical research, but as a transgression with consequences. And transgression with consequences is a story structure that the human imagination finds deeply satisfying in a way that careful methodological work does not. The story persists to this day, more than a century after the discovery, in documentaries and novels and the general cultural memory of the tomb, while the actual details of the excavation, the painstaking documentation, the conservation treatments, the decade of methodical removal and recording, are known mainly to specialists. What is worth noticing about this, from a distance of a century, is that the curse story and the archaeological story were not actually in competition for the same thing. They were addressing different needs. The curse story addressed the need to feel that the ancient world was still alive and capable of acting on the present. That 3,000 years was not so long that the dead had lost their power. That the past was not inert but watchful. This is a very old need, as old as the burial practices that created the tombs in the first place. And it is not a need that evidence can satisfy or refuse. Carter understood that the curse was nonsense in the evidentiary sense, but he was perhaps less patient than he might have been with the emotional reality that the curse story was addressing. The genuine human response to the opening of a sealed chamber that had been dark for 3,000 years, and the strange vertigo of standing at the edge of a world that had been, until that moment, unreachable. The archaeology was remarkable. The mythology was also, in its own way, a response to something real. The gold was there. The boy was there. And the question of what his short life and long forgetting meant was there, patient and unanswered, beneath all the noise. We can leave the noise of the press camp and the cables and the politics and return to the tomb itself. Because the tomb is where the real questions live. And the real questions are not about who owned the discovery or what the newspapers made of it, but about what the king and his burial reveal when you sit with them at a slower pace than the world outside the valley was willing to manage. We have been moving through the story of the finding. We can spend some time now with what was found and what it tells us about the world that produced it. The canopic shrine stood in the treasury at the eastern end of the burial chamber, a gilded structure of gilded wood topped by the crouching figure of Anubis, the jackal-headed god associated with embalming and the protection of the dead, and at each of its four corners stood a goddess, her arms outstretched in the embrace of divine protection, her gilded face turned slightly inward, as if attending to something inside the shrine. The goddesses were Isis and Nephthys and Neith and Selkat, four of the most ancient protective deities in the Egyptian system, assigned to the four compass points and the four cardinal duties of burial, protection, preservation, guidance, and welcome. They stood in the positions they had occupied since the burial party placed them there. And when Carter first saw them in the light of his lantern, the quality of the workmanship was immediately apparent. The faces detailed enough to carry individual expression, the outstretched arms carved with a care that registered as tenderness before it registered as artistry. Inside the shrine was the canopic chest, a block of calcite carved to hold four compartments, each one sealed with a stopper carved in the shape of the king's head. The face on each stopper rendered in the same idealized style as the death mask, serene and formal and unexpectedly young. The compartments held the king's preserved organs, which Egyptian burial practice required to be removed from the body and mummified separately: the liver, the lungs, the stomach, and the intestines, each placed under the protection of one of the four goddesses and one of the four sons of Horus, the divine children assigned to their guardianship. The care of the canopic equipment reflects the Egyptian understanding of the body as a collection of distinct elements, each with its own divine patron and its own role in the continued existence of the person after death. And the thoroughness of the arrangement reflects the seriousness with which the craftspeople who made it understood their work. What the objects in the treasury reveal, taken together, is a theology of extraordinary practical completeness. The Egyptians did not prepare their dead for a vague existence in a spirit world. They prepared them for a continuation of the existence they had known in life, in a realm that was organized along broadly similar principles, requiring the same material provisions and the same divine support structures. The books of the afterlife that covered the burial chamber walls, the Amdoat and the Book of Gates and the related texts, describe the journey of the sun god through the 12 hours of the night in sufficient detail that a person armed with the knowledge could navigate it, and the spells and formulae inscribed on coffin walls and papyrus scrolls were understood as functional tools, as necessary to the dead as a map is to a traveler in unfamiliar country. The tomb was not a monument, it was equipment. The relationship between the living and the dead in this system was one of ongoing obligation. The living were required to maintain the dead, to provide them with food offerings, and to speak their names aloud, because a person whose name was spoken continued to exist in a meaningful sense, and a person whose name fell out of use faded from existence in a way that the Egyptians found genuinely alarming. The erasure of Tutankhamun's name from the king lists was not merely a historical revision. It was an attempt to end him in a cosmological sense, to remove him from the maintained world of the living dead and the sustained continuity of the royal line. The fact that the erasure did not succeed, that his name was preserved in the clay of the sealed doorways and the gold of the objects within the sealed chambers, is one of the stranger ironies that history produces from time to time, where the mechanism intended to destroy a thing turns out to be exactly the mechanism that preserves it. This understanding of the tomb as equipment rather than monument has a consequence that the discovery of Tutankhamun's burial makes visible in a way that no other discovery quite does, because the other royal tombs were robbed, which means their contents were scattered and their arrangement destroyed long before modern archaeologists could see them. Tutankhamun's tomb, by the accident of its obscurity, survived intact enough to show something of the intended arrangement. The relationships between objects and their placement in the chambers, and what that arrangement reveals is a system of considerable sophistication and internal logic, the product of centuries of accumulated theological thinking about what the dead needed and how the living see centuries would provide it. The tomb is not a window onto the personal life of this particular king so much as a window onto the understanding of death that his civilization had developed over 2,000 years of practice, the most complete expression of that understanding that has survived anywhere in the world. Rest here for a moment and consider the craftspeople who made these things. They were not artists in the modern sense, working from personal vision toward personal expression. They were skilled workers operating within a system of specifications, a tradition of forms and iconography and material standards that governed what the objects should look like and how they should be made, because the theological efficacy of the objects depended on their conformity to the established forms. A canopic stopper that did not look like the approved form of the canopic stopper was not merely aesthetically incorrect, it was functionally insufficient. The craftspeople who made Tutankhamun's burial equipment understood this, and the quality of what they produced reflects not just their skill, but their belief in the importance of that skill to the purposes the objects would serve. The scale of what they produced is worth holding in mind as a human fact. More than 5,000 individual objects, made by many different hands in many different workshops, each one meeting the standards required by the theological and administrative systems that governed royal burial. The painters who covered the burial chamber walls in their vivid pigments, the goldsmiths who hammered the shrine panels and inlaid the coffin surfaces, the woodworkers who carved the guardian statues and the couches and the gilded beds, the linen weavers who produced the wrappings and the canopic cloths, the jewelers who set the stones and the glass and the paillons into settings of wire-fine gold, all of them working toward the same end, the preparation of a dead king for a journey that none of them had taken, and all of them expected to take in time. Consider what the craftspeople of the 14th century before the Common Era understood about what they were making. They were working in workshops near the Nile, under the supervision of officials responsible for the quality of the royal burial equipment, using materials that had been gathered from across the known world: gold from Nubia, lapis lazuli from what is now Afghanistan, turquoise from the Sinai, ebony from Central Africa, glass manufactured in furnaces along the Nile by techniques that had only recently been developed. The logistics of assembling these materials were considerable. The workshops that produced the objects in Tutankhamun's tomb were drawing on a supply chain that stretched from the eastern Mediterranean to the heart of Africa, and coordinating that supply chain required administrative structures of real sophistication. The objects in the tomb are not only evidence of theological conviction, they are evidence of an economy and a system of governance capable of directing that economy toward the purposes of a single burial. The mummy of the king has been examined more thoroughly than any other royal mummy in history, and the examinations have revealed details about his life that no document contemporary with his reign preserves. The first examination was conducted by the anatomist Douglas Derry in 1925, within the tomb itself, under conditions of considerable difficulty, with the mummy still partly adhered to the interior of the golden coffin. Derry estimated the king's age at death as somewhere between 18 and 22, based on the development of the skeleton, and noted the physical evidence of a clubfoot, a condition that would have made normal walking difficult and would have required the use of a walking stick, several of which were found among the objects in the antechamber, including some that showed signs of actual use other than being purely ceremonial. The more recent analyses, conducted in the early decades of the 21st century using computerized tomography scanning and DNA analysis, have added considerably to Derry's findings. The CT scans, conducted in 2005, revealed the full extent of the skeletal damage that the body had sustained, including a fracture of the left leg that appears to have occurred shortly before death, the bone showing signs of trauma, but also early stages of healing. The scans also confirmed the clubfoot, showed evidence of bone disease in several joints, and revealed a skull fracture that has been the subject of considerable debate among researchers, some arguing it was caused by a blow before death, and others concluding it was a post-mortem consequence of the mummification process. The debate about the cause of the king's death continues, and the evidence does not settle it to everyone's satisfaction. The DNA analysis, published in 2010, identified the probable parents of Tutankhamun as two individuals found in nearby tombs, and confirmed a level of genetic relatedness between his parents consistent with close family marriage, which is to say they were likely siblings or half-siblings, a pattern common in the later Amarna period royal family, and one that would have carried significant genetic risks for their offspring. The analysis also identified evidence of malaria in the mummy's tissue, of a type known as Plasmodium falciparum, the most severe form of the disease. and the combination of malaria and the other physical conditions revealed by the scans has led some researchers to suggest that the king's death may have been the result of the convergence of multiple health challenges rather than a single cause. Among the objects in the tomb, more than 100 walking sticks and staffs were catalogued, a number far in excess of what any ceremonial function would require and strongly suggestive of a king who depended on walking supports in daily life. The question of whether Tutankhamun was murdered has attracted considerable attention over the decades since the discovery, partly because of the drama of the hypothesis and partly because of the genuinely ambiguous evidence. The crack in the skull that Derry noted in 1925 was interpreted by some subsequent researchers as evidence of a blow to the head, possibly delivered while the king was still alive, possibly during the mummification process, and the murky politics of the Amarna period, with its powerful advisors and its uncertain succession, provides a context in which murder would not be implausible. But the most careful analyses of the CT scans have concluded that the skull damage is more consistent with post-mortem handling than with ante-mortem trauma, and the broader pattern of the king's health, the multiple diseases and physical disabilities visible in the skeleton, suggests a young man whose body was under considerable stress from several directions at once, for whom a comparatively early death from natural causes was not unlikely. What is remarkable about all of this is the direction of knowledge. The ancient Egyptians who buried Tutankhamun had more access to him in life than any modern researcher ever will. And yet they knew less about the physical details of his existence than the scanning equipment in a 21st century laboratory can now reveal. They knew him as a king, as a person, as the figure who walked through the palace corridors and appeared at court and performed the religious ceremonies that his role required. They did not know the specific configuration of the bones in his left foot, the malaria parasites in his bloodstream, the genetic signature in his cells. We do. The knowledge is of a different kind from theirs, and it comes from a different direction. And the two forms of knowledge together, the historical and the forensic, produce an account of a person more complete than almost any other account of any person from the ancient world. There is also what the tomb tells us about the Amarna period and its aftermath. The burial of Tutankhamun was, in some respects, a statement about the restoration of order, a demonstration that the religious system Akhenaten had disrupted had been properly reasserted. The objects in the tomb are orthodox in their iconography, the old gods in their proper positions, the old protective formulae in their proper places, the burial conducted according to the traditions that Akhenaten had suppressed and that Tutankhamun's advisors had restored, and yet the haste that is visible in some aspects of the burial, the apparent reuse of objects originally made for other purposes, the cramped arrangement of the chambers, the fact that the tomb itself was probably not originally intended for a king of Tutankhamun's status, but was adapted from a smaller tomb when the need arose suddenly, suggests that the restoration was not complete, that the administrative machinery of the old order had not fully recovered its capacity to organize a royal burial on the scale that the old standards required. The tomb is evidence of a kingdom still in the process of putting itself back together. The discovery also changed something about how the modern world understood what the ancient past could still contain. Before 1922, the scholarly consensus based on decades of excavation in the valley was that all the major tombs were accounted for, that the ancient robbers had reached everything worth finding, that the ground had given up its secrets. Tutankhamun's tomb demonstrated that this consensus was wrong in the most dramatic way available, and the demonstration has echoed through archaeology ever since. Every subsequent generation of archaeologists working in Egypt has understood that the ground may still contain things that the prevailing consensus believes to be absent, and that the absence from the record is not proof of absence from the earth. Carter was right about this in a specific case, but the principle extends far beyond the valley. Tutankhamun is now the most examined royal mummy in history. The scans and DNA analyses and forensic investigations have told us things his own contemporaries didn't know. The diseases in his bones, the malaria in his blood, the genetic complications of a dynasty that had married too closely for too long. We know him, in some respects, better than the people who buried him did, and yet the essential question of what his brief life felt like from the inside remains exactly as closed as the tomb was on the morning Carter's waterboy struck something hard beneath the sand. All of that remains now. The questions and the knowledge and the gap between them. The valley that held the king for 3,000 years is still there, and the king's face is still visible in the Cairo Museum, and the question of what it means that we found him is still worth sitting with after the story has been told. We can let the narrative rest here and return to where we began, to the pale cliffs and the dry air and the morning silence of the valley itself. The valley is quiet again now, the way it was quiet on the morning before the waterboy's stick found the edge of the first step, the limestone cliffs holding their color in the early light, the air carrying nothing but dust and the faint mineral smell of ancient rock. The tomb is still there, of course, though most of what it contained has been carried away to museums, and what remains is the shape of the space itself. The chambers cut from the living rock, the dimensions of a burial that was meant to last forever and has, in its way, kept that promise. The objects that came out of the tomb have spread over the centuries since the excavation into a presence in the world that the people who made them could not have imagined and would not have wanted. The death mask is the most recognized image from the ancient world, reproduced on every scale and in every medium available, from museum postcards to the covers of academic publications to the decorative objects sold in the shops outside the museum in Cairo. People who have never visited Egypt and have no particular interest in ancient history recognize the face of the mask, the striped headdress and the vulture and cobra at the brow and the crossed arms holding crook and flail, the formalized ideal of a king who was, underneath the idealization, a 19-year-old with a club foot and malaria and the genetic consequences of generations of close family marriage. The mask was made to be worn once, in the darkness of a sealed chamber by a person who would never open his eyes again. It has become instead one of the most looked at objects in human history. There is an argument that the Egyptian objects in museums outside Egypt should be returned, and it is an argument with considerable force. The objects were made in Egypt by Egyptians for Egyptian purposes, and their presence in the institutions of other countries is the result of the power dynamics of the 19th and early 20th centuries, rather than any arrangement that the culture that produced them would have endorsed. The Tutankhamun objects, at least, are in Cairo, in the Egyptian Museum, which is the right place for them to be, and the new Grand Egyptian Museum near the pyramids at Giza, when it receives the full collection, will give the objects a context and a presentation that does something closer to justice to their scale. But the broader question of what it means that the burial equipment of a dead king has become an attraction, has become something that hundreds of thousands of people travel to see each year, is a question that does not have a clean answer, and may not be the kind of question that is answered so much as the kind that is lived with. The entrance to the tomb is open to visitors now, as it has been since the excavation was completed and the site was returned to the Egyptian Antiquities Service. You can descend the staircase that the waterboy's stick found in November of 1922. The same steps that Carter cleared over the following days with the trembling care of a man who understood what he was uncovering, and at the bottom of the staircase the corridor leads into the antechamber, the room where the guardian statues once stood, and beyond it into the burial chamber itself, where the outermost of the nested shrines still remains in place, too large to remove without dismantling it, the gilded wood still showing the painted texts and images of the religious program that was meant to protect the king and guide him. The innermost chamber is smaller than most people expect, smaller than the imagination populated by the scale of its contents tends to produce, and standing in it is an experience of compression, the sense of a great deal having been intended for a very small space. Howard Carter spent 11 years looking at the ground in this valley and thinking about what it might contain. And during those 11 years, the valley became for him something that it cannot become for a casual visitor. A place of intimate and specific knowledge, a landscape he had internalized to the degree that he knew the composition of the debris layer underfoot and the color of the limestone. In different lights and locations of every shaft and passage that previous excavations had opened and recorded. He knew the valley the way you know a house you have lived in for a long time, without having to look at it consciously. The knowledge present in the body as well as the mind. This was the kind of knowledge that could register an absence, could notice that a particular patch of ground had never been properly cleared, and that the debris covering it was not original to the valley, but had been tipped there by earlier excavators as a convenient dumping ground for material they had not thought worth examining. The knowledge of presence produced, in the end, the knowledge of absence, and the knowledge of absence led to the staircase. There is a particular quality of attention that long familiarity with a single subject produces, and it is different from the attention of someone encountering that subject for the first time. The first encounter is necessarily general. You see the whole before you can see the parts, and the parts you see are the ones that announce themselves, the prominent features, the obvious characteristics. The attention of long familiarity is narrower and stranger. It is drawn to anomalies, to the things that do not fit the established pattern, to the gaps in what should be a continuous record. Carter's attention, by the autumn of 1922, had become precisely this kind of attention. He was not looking for something to find. He was looking at what he knew and noticing where the knowledge did not reach. That kind of attention is not teachable in the ordinary sense. It accumulates through time and through a particular quality of engagement with the material, a refusal to be satisfied with the general account, a persistent return to the specific. Carter had been returning to the specific details of the valley for 11 years, and the specific detail he had been returning to, the detail that would not resolve itself into the known pattern of the valley's contents, was the absence of a tomb that the historical record suggested should be there. The staircase was the resolution of that return. What changed in November of 1922 was not only what we knew, it was what we understood to be possible. The scholarly consensus that the valley had given up everything it had to give was not an unreasonable conclusion, given the evidence available at the time. Decades of excavation, tomb after tomb opened and found to be robbed, the prevailing logic of ancient robbers being thorough and systematic in their work. Carter's disagreement with that consensus was not based on evidence that contradicted it. It was based on the observation of an absence, a gap in the king lists, a name that appeared in a few inscriptions and nowhere else, a reign so brief and so thoroughly erased that the consensus had not bothered to account for it. The lesson of the discovery is not that stubborn optimism is always rewarded. It is that the record is always incomplete, and that incompleteness has a geography, and that someone with sufficient patience and sufficient attention to the shape of what is missing may sometimes find what the record left out. Carter spent the rest of his life on the excavation and its documentation. The 10 years of work in the tomb after the discovery were in many ways harder than the 11 years of searching that preceded it. The political difficulties, the public pressure, the physical demands of working in the confined spaces of the tomb day after day, the slow accumulation of objects to be documented and conserved and transported. He wrote 2 volumes of the excavation report before his death in 1939 and left a third unfinished. He never achieved the academic recognition that some of his contemporaries received, in part because his formal education had ended at 17, and in part because the discovery itself had made him a public figure of a kind that sat uneasily within the structures of academic archaeology. He died in London, quietly, at the age of 64, having spent more of his adult life in Egypt than in England, having done the one thing that will attach his name permanently to the history of the ancient world. Carter spent the last 17 years of his life working on the excavation records, and the records are themselves a kind of monument, more durable in some ways than the physical objects they describe. The card index he maintained, the thousands of index cards on which he recorded the position and condition and description of each object as it was removed from the tomb, represents a form of attention that we tend to undervalue because it produces documents rather than objects, because it is methodical rather than dramatic, because it is methodical rather than dramatic, because the drama of the discovery tends to overwhelm in the popular act und, the decade of painstaking work that transformed the discovery into knowledge, the photographs that Harry Burton took inside the tomb, the glass plate negatives that captured the objects in their original positions before any disturbance, constitute a visual record of a sealed room that no longer exists as it was. A room that was its own thing for 3,000 years and is now a different thing, opened and emptied and converted into a site of historical significance. Burton's photographs are the closest thing we have to seeing what Carter saw. Carter did not receive, in his lifetime, the formal recognition that his work deserved. He was not elected a Fellow of the British Academy. He was not awarded a knighthood, though the question of why he was not has been discussed with some bitterness by historians of the period. He had made the most significant archaeological discovery of the century, and he received from the British establishment a silence that was not quite indifference, but was certainly not equivalent to what the discovery merited. In Egypt, his situation was more complicated. His relationships with the Egyptian authorities strained by the political tensions that the Times exclusive had inflamed, and by broader questions about the ownership of the discovery. He died as he had lived, at some distance from the centers of institutional recognition, a man whose achievement was acknowledged by everyone and rewarded by almost no one in the ways that institutions reward achievement. What he left behind is the excavation itself, preserved in the records and the photographs and the published volumes and the index cards that are now held in archives, and the knowledge that the valley still holds its ground in the way that it always held its ground, with the ancient indifference of stone to the concerns of the people who move across its surface. The record Carter produced is consulted by Egyptologists to this day. The photographs still the primary visual evidence for the arrangement of the tomb as found. The card index still the most complete catalogue of the objects as they existed at the moment of discovery. It is the kind of work that outlasts its maker without diminishing, that becomes more valuable as the years pass and the original conditions recede further into the irretrievable past. Carter was a careful man in an impatient world, and the care has held. The valley receives its visitors now with the equanimity of a place that has seen a great deal of human business come and go. The coaches park at the entrance in the early morning, before the heat has reached the valley floor, and the visitors move through the paths between the tomb entrances with their guidebooks and their cameras and their particular version of the attention that old places draw from the people who come to them. Some of the visitors descend into the tomb, into the staircase and the corridor and the antechamber and the burial chamber beyond it, passing through the same spaces that the burial party passed through 33 centuries ago with their torches and their natron and their carefully wrapped cargo, and the experience of the descent is, for most visitors, not quite what they expected. The spaces, smaller than the imagination populated by the scale of the contents tends to produce, the walls closer, the air different. They stand for a moment in the burial chamber, take their photographs, and return to the surface and the waiting coaches and the present world. The valley watches them go with its limestone patience. It has seen this before in various forms, across a span of time that makes the present century feel very brief. And when the last coach has left and the entrance gates have closed and the valley is quiet again, in the way it was quiet before any of this began, the pale cliffs hold their color in the late light, and the rock keeps its ancient counsel. Think for a moment about all the tombs that were robbed. Every other royal burial in the Valley of the Kings was entered by ancient thieves, some within years of the original sealing, some within decades. And what those thieves took was not simply treasure in the abstract sense of objects made of precious materials. They took the burial equipment of a person, the carefully assembled material provisions for an existence beyond this one, the objects that the surviving family and the priests and the administrators of the royal mortuary cult had assembled with the specific intention of maintaining the dead king in the afterlife in a form appropriate to his dignity. The robbers were not thinking about any of this. They were thinking about the weight of the gold and the value of the linen and the price the alabaster would fetch in whatever market they had access to. The theological significance of the objects was not their concern, but the theological significance is what we lose when the objects are gone. What makes Tutankhamun's tomb different from every other royal burial in the valley is not simply the gold, though the gold is remarkable, not simply the mask, though the mask is extraordinary, but the completeness of the picture it provides. Because the tomb was intact, we can see not just what the objects are, but how they were arranged. And the arrangement tells us things about Egyptian burial theology that the robbed tombs, their contents scattered and their organization destroyed, cannot tell us. We can see which objects were placed in which rooms, which were given the positions of honor closest to the body, which were placed at the 4 cardinal points of the chamber in accordance with the theological requirements of the burial texts. We can see, in other words, the system in operation, rather than merely the components of the system in isolation. That is rare. It is, in the context of royal Egyptian burial, almost unique. And it is the result of an accident of forgetting that the original actors in this story would have found bewildering. The priests who struck Tutankhamun's name from the king lists were trying to erase him. They succeeded in erasing him from the official record of the past. What they could not have known, and would have found deeply troubling if they had, was that the erasure was itself a form of preservation, that the forgotten tomb in the valley would survive exactly because it was forgotten, and that the survival of the forgotten tomb would eventually give the forgotten king a fame exceeding that of almost any of the kings whose names were carefully preserved and properly maintained and solemnly spoken in the mortuary temples for generation after generation. The valley is patient with ironies of this kind. It has been receiving the dead and their intentions for long enough to have accumulated a great number of outcomes that the people who arranged those intentions would not have expected. The Ramesside kings who were buried in the great decorated tombs further up the valley The tombs that have been known and visited and quarried for materials since antiquity are now far less present in the world's imagination than the boy king buried in the small adapted tomb near the entrance, the king whose burial was hastily arranged and whose memory was systematically suppressed. The suppression failed. The great monuments succeeded only in making their kings abstract, figures of historical weight but diminishing human texture, while the forgotten king in the forgotten tomb has become, through the completeness of what his burial preserved, one of the most concretely present individuals from the ancient world. The 5,000 objects from the tomb are scattered now, as objects from great discoveries tend to become scattered. The majority in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, others in institutions that received pieces in the years after the excavation. The records of what came from where and when preserved in the documentation that Carter and his team produced. The documentation that was the real achievement of the work, more durable in some ways than the objects themselves. The craftspeople who made those objects expected them to remain in the tomb. They were wrong about that, as they were wrong about most of the things they expected to happen in the world they could not see. But they were not wrong about the objects lasting. The gold has lasted. The lapis has lasted. The obsidian has lasted. The calcite and the gilded wood and the painted images on the chamber walls have lasted in the dry, sealed air of the valley, through everything that the intervening millennia arranged against them. The boy lasted too, not in the way the burial intended, not moving through the 12 hours of the night with the sun god, sustained by the offerings and the spoken name and the protective formulae inscribed on every surface available to inscribe them. He lasted in the way that things last when the conditions are right and the disturbance is minimal and time, for once, does nothing more than pass. The dry air, the sealed rock, the darkness that preserved what it enclosed. There is something in this that is worth sitting with at the end of a story. The valley is still quiet at this hour. The cliffs still hold the last of the night. Somewhere beneath your feet, if you are standing in the right place, the rock that was cut 3,000 years ago is still cut. The shape of the chambers is still the shape it was. The walls still carry their painted figures. The questions they were meant to answer are still the questions they were always meant to answer. Some of them we have found ways to approach. Some of them remain as they have always been, beyond reach in the dark. The mask is in Cairo. It sits in a case in the Egyptian Museum, lit from above. The gold still the color it was when the craftsman finished it. The lapis lazuli still deep blue. The obsidian eyes still open. It was made to be worn in darkness by a boy who would never open his eyes again, in a room that was not meant to be entered. The people who made it believed completely in what they were making. They believed the king would need it, and they made it accordingly, with the care you bring to something that matters absolutely. 3,000 years passed. Empires rose and collapsed. Languages were born and died without leaving a single reader behind. The valley filled with sand, and the entrances to the tombs were buried. And new people came to the valley who had no idea what was beneath their feet, and they built their houses over the rubble and went about their lives. And underneath it all, in the dark and the dry air of a sealed chamber, the mask waited. Not patiently, because patience requires awareness. Simply present in the way that things are present when there is no one to know they are there. The gold kept its color. The lapis kept its blue. The obsidian eyes stayed open in the dark. Until one morning, the light came in. Thank you for spending this evening in the Valley of the Kings. If this is the kind of company you like to keep at night, subscribing to the channel means the next story will be waiting whenever you are ready. There is always another tomb, another season, another question that turned out to have an answer buried just beneath the surface. Sleep well.